Good evening. I'm Reverend Lisa Ward, minister at First Parish in Milton. We're proud to be a congregational partner with the UU Urban Ministry, which we've been for years. Tonight's program with Byron Rushing on affordable housing, racism, and I would add classism is of grave importance in Milton as well. This is once again a great example of how the UU Urban Ministry serves Roxbury and beyond to advance racial, social, and economic justice. Each time we learn from these conversations, we expand our understanding of the choices we need to make to advance the cause of multicultural, intergenerational harmony of being. Here at First Parish, we're engaging in activism to address racism, food insecurity, climate change, and immigration justice. Keep your ears and eyes open for the programming at the UU Urban Ministry. Truly a gift, an inspiration, and hope for humanity.
Good evening. I am so proud to be joining you with my colleague Monique Marshallville for our fourth season of Community Conversations, an effort that we began during the COVID shutdown and that we continue in order to highlight issues that are of importance in the Roxbury community. And as a matter of tradition, we invite our good friend and the historian, Byron Rushing, to frame the season ahead for us. This season, we are beginning to unpack some of the ways that the system of housing and real estate has disadvantaged the African American community in Boston and Greater Boston and led to greater segregation. And tonight, Byron Rushing is going to give us an overview about the history of housing and racism in Boston. And it's my honor to again introduce Byron to you. Byron's history in working for justice is long and deep. He was born in New York City, and he's lived in Boston since 1964. During the 60s, he was active in the civil rights movement, working for the Congress of Racial Equality in Syracuse and as a community organizer for the Northern Student Movement in Boston. He began some of the earliest organizing in a Black community against the war in Vietnam. He's a deeply knowledgeable historian, and from 1972 to 85 was president of the Museum of Afro-American History. Under his direction, the Afro-American Museum purchased and began restoration of the African Meeting House, the oldest extant Black church building in the United States. He served for more than 35 years in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, including serving as House Majority Whip. His priorities were human and civil rights and the development of democracy, local human, economic, and housing development, and housing and health care for all. He was one of the original sponsors of the Gay Rights Bill and chief sponsor of the law to end discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in public schools. He was one of the leaders in the convention to maintain same-sex marriage in Massachusetts and successfully co-sponsored the transgender civil rights bill. There are many, many other things that we could say about Byron Rushing. One of the things that I'm most proud of is that he served for many years on the board of the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry. For his whole life, he's been a champion of justice. He stood loudly against racism. And for me personally, he's been somebody that teaches me every time I listen to him. And so I'm so grateful that he's going to be joining us tonight to give us an overview about the history of housing and racism in Greater Boston. Welcome, Byron Rushing.
How has Boston gotten away with being segregated for so long? So I just borrowed that title from a great article in Boston Magazine by Catherine Elton about 2 or 3 years ago, and I consider it probably one of the essential questions. Is I don't think anybody can argue with the fact that how segregated Boston is, but what we can argue about is why. And I think that that is really what we need to look at this evening. So let me begin by saying first that Black people have been here for almost ever. Europeans invade this part of North America in around the 1600s, and the Puritans come to Boston intentionally around 1600, 1620, and almost immediately they engage in the slave trade. And that begins, which is another great story that we all need to talk about, that begins when they decide first to enslave Native Americans. And so around 1635, Native Americans figure out, or some of them do, that living with these funny people is not going to really work out. So the tensions grow to the First Pequod War. And of course, the colonialists, the English, win that war. And when they win that war, it is not enough for them to sign a peace treaty. They decide to enslave many of those Native American prisoners of war. And they send the group off away. As you would imagine, this is not the best place to keep Native Americans that you want to have enslaved, since they've been here a little longer than you have if you're English. And so they send them to other islands, to other colonies of Puritans that are being founded at the time. And this group, sent out on a ship called the Desire, captained by a Mr. Pierce, arrived in a new Puritan colony off the coast of Central America, which they had called Providence Isle. And he sells them or barters them there. When he returns, however, he has brought another group of human beings. He has brought Africans, because the Puritans on Providence Isle in 1637 and had begun to engage in the African slave trade. And he sees some of these people and decides to bring them back to Massachusetts. And they arrive here in 1638. And that is a remarkable, of course, round trip to send enslaved Native Americans and buy enslaved Africans. And 1638 is when those first Africans get to Massachusetts, and we have been here ever since. That development I mention here only because we always have to begin at the beginning, and we have to begin with the understanding that our history is a history of Africans in Boston from the very beginning. Black people, of course, are enslaved, most of them. And so they have no community, geographic community, because they live wherever their owners want them to live. And eventually, though, and within 100 years, for a variety of reasons, Africans are starting to become emancipated, to become free again. And as that happens, they have to find places to live. A small group of them live in the North End, but almost everybody in Boston lived in the North End. And then after the American Revolution, a dramatic thing happens around slavery in Massachusetts, and that is in the late 1780s, the brand new Supreme Court of Massachusetts decides that slavery should be illegal because of the brand new section of the brand new Constitution of this state, Massachusetts, that defined liberty. And the court ruled that under that definition, there could be no enslaved people in Massachusetts, and Black people are emancipated. And that causes a serious transition, but that serious transition is to finding housing for themselves. And they do that. One of the interesting things about our rules about slavery is that when the censuses began in the United States, we did not count people by color. We counted people by enslavement. So we know how many slaves were in the United States, but we don't know how many free Black people there were in the United States for another 20 years when that count began in the United States Census. So we know that in 1820, in Boston, there were 2,103 Black people according to the census. That population, as many of you know, moves to what we call Beacon Hill. They didn't call it, neither white people nor Black people called it Beacon Hill. They called it the West End. And on one half of the West End, on the half where the Boston Common is, white people who had benefited from the economy of the American Revolution began to build their mansion houses, but there were not enough to fill up the whole hill. And so on the back of the hill, the land was there for anyone who could afford it. And that's what we call the North Slope of Beacon Hill. And that's where the Black population as a community settled on a defined piece of geography. They were serious about it. They not only were able to buy homes, build homes, but of course, white developers came in and started building houses, which they rented to the African Americans. And Black people in that community organizing a church. Fortunately, that building still exists. It's the African Meeting House, built in 1806, and schools and other activities. But that community remained, although it had a number of white working class people sharing it with them, it remained the geography where most African Americans lived for that whole century, and began to leave around 1880, 1890. And when they start to move, they one of the neighborhoods that they moved to is the South End. And I want to talk about the South End for a little bit, because the South End represents a very important example of how Black people get housing. And they get housing when white people run into serious monetary financial problems. The South End, as you all know, is this large neighborhood of mostly row houses, and it was built by upper middle class and relatively rich white people right after the Civil War. And it was the second most popular community for rich people after Beacon Hill, but rich people were getting more and more populous in this city, and another community was starting to be developed, what we now call Back Bay. And so Black people, the only Black people that you would see in the South End during this period would be an occasional servant or workman, a janitor. But there was a major depression in the United States. In those days, they called them panics. And that happened in the 1870s, 1890. And interestingly, the white people who were there did not have enough capital to survive, and they started to have foreclosures on their housing. And as we know about foreclosures, the one person who benefits from foreclosures, the one institution who benefits from foreclosures is banks. They lose money immediately, but then they own the property. And the banks in Boston realized that the only population that might be able to take over those mortgages are people of color. And they start to grant mortgages to people of color in Boston at that time. Of course, the people of color had to figure out how to pay those mortgages, and they, of course, could not continue to have one-family houses. So the housing they bought, they generally divided up. They divided it up into apartments. They lived in one and rented out the rest, or they divided it up into rooming houses. And that is the South End that those of us who are old enough to remember pre-gentrification, that was the South End that we knew. And by the turn of the 20th century, had also expanded into Lower Roxbury. It is important to understand that during this period, right, Black people did not fill up the South End. There is probably no time when Black people were more than 65% of the South End. They shared it with a number of working class white people, which is a piece of that history that we should not forget. But that was the center of the Black community, the South End and Lower Roxbury. As this Black population, now we're talking about 1910 or so, 1910, 1920, this Black population was only still small. And so we're talking about 13,000 to 16,000 people. We're talking about a percentage of Boston of about 2% being African American. And so Boston is growing, but it is not growing with African Americans being the source of that growth. It is growing because of European immigrants. First, the major immigration of the 19th century, the Irish, and then following them, the Italians and Eastern Europeans, which brings the large community of Jewish people into Boston as immigrants. There is no significant increase in the number of the size of the Black community until World War II. Unlike a number of northern cities, Boston was not the end of the trip in the great internal migration of Black people from the South to the North. That great migration went other places, and the major reason for that was that Boston was not that prosperous city and had very few jobs for outsiders, unlike Detroit and New York and Philadelphia and Chicago, where most of them moved from the South to the North. Black people sort of found out about Boston after they were in the North. Most of the Black people who immigrated to Boston during that period had already lived in another northern city before they got here. That all changes in World War II. One of the major things that changed in World War II is the economy of Boston became better. And so there were more jobs available to other people. So jobs that were available to Black people in other cities in the North had not been available to them until really the end of World War II. It's interesting, and we have to remember this about Boston, is how poor the white people were. And so the jobs that Black people would get in other cities were not available to them here because white people were still poor and they were working those kinds of jobs. White people were still janitors. They were still doing low-level jobs in the community that they weren't in other places. And so there was a serious competition for these jobs racially, and of course, Black people lost out. But that all changes after World War II. An example of that is that in Boston in 1940, there were 23,000 Black people. In 1950, there were 40,000. That was an increase from 3% of the population to 5% of the population, and it kept growing until about 2 or 3 years ago. A larger and larger percentage of Black people in Boston. What is remarkable for me during all that time is that there was no protections for Black people in Boston if they were discriminated against. There was no place they could go to object. And white people just assumed that's the way it was, that there was no reason to invite Black people into anything that white people ran. You cannot find an institution in Boston, right, that actually for most of the 20th century, that ever reached out and said, oh, we want Black people coming here. It was generally incidental and generally coincidental that Black people would be seen with white people other than in an employee-employer situation in Boston until the end of the 20th century. When a Black artist sang at Symphony Hall, it was news. And of course, it was the only time that Black people went to Symphony Hall, was to hear Roland Hayes and subsequent Black artists. It is important to just, in all of this discussion, to understand how natural racial segregation was considered. Between Reconstruction, the end of Reconstruction, nothing political was done to benefit Black people until the New Deal. And then, of course, all of those so-called improvements in the economy were almost all entirely segregated. And probably for us in this discussion around residential segregation, that was probably most noticeable with the decision by the Roosevelt administration to build public housing. This was a radical idea that the government should build and own housing that would be affordable to people. And but Boston is a perfect example of that segregation from the very beginning. It never dawned on white people in this city that you would build housing that would be available for both. But so the first public housing project, as we used to call them, in Boston was built in South Boston, and the second one was built in Roxbury. Roxbury got the public housing on Camden Street and Camden and Lenox Street as the second public housing built in the city, but with no assumption that it was ever going to be Black people and white people living together. And that continued. And so we had, and that segregation was sometimes very dramatic. When Orchard Park Housing Project was built, there were several parts of the project that were reserved for white people, supposedly reserved for veterans. But it turned out that that part of the building at the beginning was all white. And when Mission Hill was built for white people, for white families, when it was extended to build an adjacent public housing project, Mission Hill Extension, as it was called, that was all white. One of my early experiences when I came here as an organizer was meeting people, Black people, at Mission Hill Extension, and one of their major complaints was that when they went to pay their rent in the office, there was one counter for Mission Hill and a separate counter for Mission Hill Extension tenants to pay their rent. Of course, and then and this, of course, we were in the midst of the civil rights movement, and so of course, Black people saw that as they might as well put up signs that say white and colored. And that was one of the first things I engaged in, was getting the BHA to stop that and have one counter for everybody to pay their rent. I cannot overemphasize how natural that seemed, and how there was little or no opposition in the white community to any of this. Again, to benefit working class people in this city, on one hand, was the idea of urban renewal. But again, the first urban renewal projects were done in white communities, some to incredibly destructive, and then in Roxbury and Washington Park and that campus high school. I have tried to figure out what we could have done. And of course, that is back to the title that I borrowed. How has Boston gotten away with being segregated for so long? And I have to begin to wrap up this introduction by saying it is absolutely 100% white people. And there were very few cities where white people were supported by the government and by major economic institutions to be and continue to be racist. And we live in one of those cities. And so it is very difficult to find examples of white elected officials saying, oh, let's try to adjust this a little bit. And you certainly didn't see it in the banks. The major shift, Black people living in Roxbury and the South End continued until urban renewal and gentrification in the South End. Black people generally were able to stay in Lower Roxbury and not be pushed out by white people who had changed their mind. But Roxbury became the center and major dense population of Black people in Boston until the 1960s. And the solution for that by white people was to give Black people more space to live in, not to integrate anything, not to invite them into any other part of the city that they could afford to live in, but to expand the geography for them. And that, of course, the cause of that is, of course, the major tragedy for Black people in the 20th century, and that's the assassination of Martin Luther King. Black people had rioted around housing in 1967 in Roxbury, and then with his assassination and the subsequent tension that created in Black people, white people were finally scared, and bankers got scared, and they didn't know and they looked for a solution, but the solution they picked was to expand the geography that Black people could live in, not to allow Black people to live anywhere they could afford. And that, of course, is what we all know of as BIPOC, and that is the set of decisions that have framed the present boundaries of the Black community going south of Franklin Park and out to Mattapan. And BIPOC was called the Boston Urban Renewal Group, the Boston Banks Urban Renewal Group. And what it was Boston Banks decided to use FHA guaranteed loans that they'd been using for white people for years since they were invented, to use a percentage of the FHA loans that were available to the banks for Black people. Imagine this. FHA guaranteed loans were not available to Black people because of redlining in Boston until 1969, a year after Martin's assassination. And that is what brought Black people. Now, I don't know how many Black people are as old as I am. When I came to Boston, the southern boundary of Roxbury was Columbia Road and Seaver Street. Literally, if you walked across Columbia Road, you were in white Dorchester. And if you went south of Franklin Park, you were in another white neighborhood, which was predominantly Jewish, with a significant number of Irish Americans living in that neighborhood from Dorchester out to Mattapan. And that was the geography that the banks decided on. And it's important to understand. There's been a lot of writing about this. I don't think most descriptions of that movement speak to a very important thing in Boston, which we haven't been talking about, which was anti-Semitism. I think that there was no reason why that Jewish working class neighborhood was chosen, other than white people didn't like the Jews either. And so that population literally left Boston. That's why we're one of the major cities in the United States with no Jewish community. And then Black people had to pay major premiums to buy the houses that were available to them. And those premiums came informally from real estate agents who took advantage of that movement and overcharged Black people as they underbought property from the white people who are moving out of those neighborhoods. And that's why we're where we are today, right? Look at the boundaries, and those are the boundaries. The whole Black community in Boston is contiguous. Right? We are only incidentally living in other parts of the city. So what do you do with this? to get back to that question, so we know how they've gotten away with it. The question is, can you change it? And I think that's the question for the rest of this evening is, can you change it? Right? I think that that is an incredibly difficult question to answer. In my old age, in my retirement, right, I can be a little more outspoken, I think, though some people don't think I am. I can be a little more outspoken, and I think there's no way out of this. To end this here, like to end it anywhere in the United States, is to end racism. And we have not found an effective way to end racism in this country, right? There are significant anti-racist white people in this country, but they are not close to the majority of white people in this country. And I think that's similar in the state of Massachusetts. And so most white people in Massachusetts don't live with Black people. Most of them. Most white people who work in Boston, when they wake up in the morning and go to work, don't see a Black person on the street until they get to the city. Right? I mean, think about that. And think about the comfort zone that seems to provide them. Right? It never, no, they don't come back home and said, we should have a few more Black people here. And so I think that's where we start. And I think that the answer to this question really is revolutionary, because the answer to this question is ending racism in the United States and in Massachusetts and in Boston.
So before we ask any questions, I had nothing to do with those photographs that they dug up of me when I was a child. So I don't know if anybody, the only one that was really interesting, there's that you might have gone by too fast. There was a photograph of me with Howard Carver, and we used to talk to each other, right? So, all right. So, question. I don't have anything else to say but to answer, questions and to listen to other people's experiences. And you know me, so I have no problem getting into an argument if you think that I said things that didn't make any sense. Right. Thank you.
Thank you. So again, thank you for all of your knowledge that you always share with us, Mr. Byron. And as I was listening to you talk about the situation in Boston, it made me think about how things are still, inequitable, and thinking about how there's still low numbers of home ownership and the racial wealth gap. And we know that those are byproducts of racism, as you spoke so eloquently and nicely about, but also very truthfully. And we know that those are systemic problems. And as I think about the work that we want to do to change that, how can we as urban ministry and community members really start to change that and think about how does that impact education? And does it mean that we should do things differently to educate the community, our young people? What can we do to change some of that inequity that's still happening around home ownership here in Austin?
I think that the first part of your question is that there is no reason from any evidence of the past few years, just in terms of housing, to think anything's going to get different. So it's a question of how do we improve the housing situation in Boston. But one thing it is important to understand is that, as I just mentioned very quickly in my remarks, is that no more Black people are coming to Boston. Black people who are in there when they make decisions after college have given up on this place. There has been no increase in the percentage of Black people in Boston in the past 30 years. None. And so the population gets a little bigger, but not much bigger. So the percentage of Black people in Boston that you have now is probably what you're going to have for the rest of our lifetimes. And there might be a significant decrease in that. So when people say Boston is 50% people of color, understand that 50% of that 50% is Black. The other 50% is other people of color. And I don't know about you and your children, those of you who have children that age, in their late 20s, early 30s, raise your hand if they live in Boston. Exactly. And, so, when I want to go see my grandkids, I go to Washington. And I think that is typical. So so the question is, then what do we do with all of that? And I don't think there is going to be a significant change in that until there's a significant change in white people. And so at the rate we're going, I suspect that we will hopefully never have another white mayor ever. The only, the only reason we don't have a black mayor is because the black candidates couldn't get themselves together.
Okay, Byron, we have a question from our audience. I'm just going to come a little closer so maybe people can sort of hear. I don't know if you can see me, but hi everybody, and we're trying to figure out the live stream thing. So Susie has this question. Bill McKibben's recent book, The Bible, the Flag, and the Station Wagon, addresses this topic from the perspective of the suburbs. In public polling in Lexington in the 1960s, everyone was vocal in support of bringing in affordable housing. But when it came to a vote in the privacy of a voting booth, it was turned down. That is her comment. Do you have any comment on that, Byron?
Yeah, I suspect that most of the objection to public housing, to affordable housing outside of the city in the suburbs comes from the fear of the color of those people. So if you could guarantee that only working class white people would live in that housing, I suspect you'd get a lot more positive votes.
And I want to.
I just want people to understand how terrible this is. Don't leave this thinking that there is a solution, because the solution is a solution that only can be solved by the majority of people in the United States, and that's not us.
So I'm gonna start a question, and I want to remind people, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand. We'll speak into the mic, or if you want to come forward, whatever is most comfortable. So you said that the problem is racism. How do we transform racism, Byron?
I think the only people who can figure that out are white people. I mean, they're literally, we have never supported white people being racist. Can you think of one black organization that said, we like it? We like white racists, right? So we've never done that. So it's not us to solve that. It really isn't. There's no way I can figure out that could be solved by black people, right? We've had to protect ourselves from white people, we've had leaders who have tried to remind white people of their morality, but we have never had a group of black people who have figured out how to do it. Yes.
Maybe if you want to go close, so folks at home can.
I don't want to get too close. First, Byron, thank you very much for your presentation. It's like the Reader's Digest response to housing in Boston. The question was, how did Boston get away with racism in housing for so long? And I think the response I have is that because Black folks really didn't fight hard enough to change that process, that we were more than tolerant for too long. That is why some people stay slaves longer than others. We didn't have to fight for our slavery in Massachusetts. The Constitution took it away. So in other parts of the country where they fought and had to fight continuously to get the right to vote and to get access to opportunities, they seem to be doing a little bit better because they fight against it. As you well know, that as head of NACP in 1989, despite the fact that Doris Punty, who was a Black woman, was head of the Boston Housing Authority, she opposed us challenging the city of Boston to open up public housing. Housing is the key, the foundation of all community development, all community growth and access. And so it was amazing to me that people were so tranquil and willing to accept this long-term process of segregation in public housing since everybody's taxes went to create public housing. So when the NACP decided to sue the city of Boston, we got as much pushback from members of the Black community, some political leaders and some church leaders, as we got from the mayor, Ray Flynn at the time, and other people. I think that for any problem to exist, you have to have compliance of the victim along with the perpetrators in order for it to continue for a very long time. And so the challenge that we've had in Boston, I've seen, and I've worked in a number of places around the country, in different places in the world, that Black folks here are very compliant with a lot of things that should have been challenged and fought back for a long time. No one has basically promoted racism, but for you to do nothing or say nothing, for you to take the, I guess, to take the path least aggressive, I think contributes to racism feeling like it has control. The other example I would give, first and second thing, on the housing, we sued the city of Boston and made them open up public houses throughout the city. And that changed.
I want you to say that again.
Okay. We sued the city of Boston and our good friend Doris Martinez, my neighbor, in order to open up public housing in the city, and that changed the face of Boston in terms of races, because there were places, whether it was Hyde Park, Meadville, Boston, Brighton, Charlestown, East Boston, South Boston, that Black people could not live and could not go. And even to the extent that we were every place from cathedral housing all the way up to Mattapan, you know, there still was challenges that Black people couldn't go into certain places. And so the school desegregation didn't change that. School desegregation could not change that because if people don't live in a community, they don't change the ethos of that community. So we sued the city of Boston and we won, but we didn't stop there. We sued the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Community Development, and we forced them to take in consideration what Judge Toro said at the time. They were supposed to open up low and moderate income housing in the near suburbs, includes Newton, Milton, Quincy, places like that, which leads me to believe that the challenge, while it's focused on race, has a lot to do with class. And so there are a lot of lace curtain Irish that weren't able to go to certain places in the city. There were a lot of people that were not rich, who were white folks who couldn't go to certain places in the city. So caste and class, along with race, has really challenged us in the city of Boston, but the racism became predominant. So the last part of this is that when I look and see Boston, how they handle things, particularly Black people in Boston, we went the path of least resistance, rather than fighting the Boston School Department, the Boston School Committee, and fighting the mayor to make Boston schools work for Black children. We exported our children outside the city. We took the Medco route or Exodus into the city, and so we basically left it. And so as time has gone along, we still have programs where we think our children have to go someplace else in a different culture, in a different environment, get the education they should get at home. So I think that what made Boston racism succeed is the lack of aggressiveness, commitment on Black people to fight what should be theirs within their community.
I think it's in, I want to try to be as objective about this in terms of white people and Black people. I think that from certainly, I mean, certainly from the time of Black abolitionists, but all during Reconstruction, Black people always were welcoming to white people. So white people didn't want to respond to that welcoming. And you know, I would never make a speech like Martin Luther King did, calling up the morality of white people for white people to remember that morality that they espoused from the American Revolution. But they had the chance to listen, and they still have the chance to listen. And I think that that is probably if you ask the detail, what does it mean about ending racism? The question is, why is it so difficult for them? Because it's not difficult for us. And now we have our opportunities to decide that we'll just try to do it all by ourselves. And we can develop a mythology of that, like the nation did, right? Or we can do that in just a day at life and work that we do. But I do think it is really on the leadership of the white community that we could not integrate the Boston police. We could not integrate the Boston Fire Department. And of course, we could not integrate schools without suing. Public housing is integrated because Black people, the NAACP, sued, as you said. And I think that's what we have to struggle with.
Thank you, Byron. I guess we have time for one more online question and maybe one live question. If there's somebody else who has a question, we do want to still respect our 7 p.m. ending, although folks can linger for a bit. So Kevin says, there's so much, thanks so much for this very important talk. I live near Waltham, which seems to be more integrated than Newton. Is there any history to that?
That's a great question. There is what we are finding in terms of housing patterns as it relates to race in Massachusetts is that as Black people are not able to afford to live in their neighborhoods, like the South End, they cannot find neighborhoods to move to inside Boston that they can afford. And so they have been moving to more and more working class communities or communities with larger working class white populations than other suburbs. So Black people generally have been finding ways to do that in other smaller communities in the city, in the state, and moving to those places. How that works out is going to be interesting. The tensions that the first tensions, there's been a little bit of violence, but the most obvious tension that existed in all those places is politics, and who gets to win the elections, and who becomes the mayors, and who becomes the city councilors if their cities are on to whatever the leadership group is in that town, and that might be the way it gets resolved for Black people in this state.
All right, I think we're going to have one live question, then we're going to conclude. But the people who are here in person might be able to pick your brain a little bit more. But Marie, do you want to come up, or you want to? Get close to Byron.
Yeah, I'm Marie Furman, and I have a business called Black Biz Development Group LLC, and my passion is to teach our youth entrepreneurship for several reasons, because they can use the skills to get a job, and they can use the skills to create a job. And I also, I'm delving into looking at our entrepreneurial experience from the 1900s until 1965, because when I was a little girl, my father used to take me around to his friends, and everybody owned a business. Everyone owned a business. I think that entrepreneurship should be a course that all of our children should take. because of the skills that it gives. And I want to thank you for being so honest. You really made me think about my work and think about, you know, what this all has to do with housing, because our children are homeless, literally. I had a group of students and some of them did not have a home.
Mhm.
And so, you know, I'm teaching them entrepreneurship. They don't have a home and it's difficult. How does reparations play in to this whole idea of racism? And if we were to get reparations, will we all move out of Boston?
Yeah.
Because, you know, it's really hard. And you
Right.
expressed.
I just want to thank you for saying two things. One is how important it is for us to be raising as much money as we can. There ain't nothing wrong with raising as much money as you can. Though I'm a little concerned about the richest Negroes in Massachusetts, because they seem very stingy. But anyway, but we need to be doing that. But also, all of this history is involved with stuff being taken from us from the very beginning, ourselves, as human beings being taken from us, and it continues. And reparation is a good way to end this. Raising reparations is a good way to end this conversation, because it's going to have to be the next conversation. But it is definitely should be talked about. And no Black person, they can argue about how you do it, but no Black person should say there should not be restitution and reparation.